My guest today is the Right Honorable David Miliband. He was the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, and he is now the President and the CEO of the International Rescue Committee, the IRC. And I'm going to ask him what he thinks the future of refugees might look like in a post-COVID world.
I think there are two dynamics at play here, or two and a half dynamics. One is that obviously the COVID crisis has led to a closing of borders. And in the hands of some of the national leaders around the world, this will provide a convenient basis for a longer term shutting of borders, which is obviously a grave threat to refugees and asylum seekers who are fleeing for their lives. On the other hand, I think that the crisis has demonstrated the danger of holes in the global safety net. And I hope, at least the hopeful part of me, says that part of the response to COVID must be a recognition that the crisis of diplomacy that has allowed wars in Yemen and elsewhere to burn in the way they have over the last decade, the crisis of rights that in many ways has left people more and more desperate and more in the hands of people smugglers, that has been a significant feature of the last decade. And also the gaping problems with healthcare. I was on the phone on the Zoom call today with our team in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country of 100 million people with 5 ventilators. So I hope that those factors will spur a recognition that not just as a moral question, but also as a strategic question, the world can't afford these large swathes of insecurity, instability, inequality.
The IRC, of course, understands crises. What do you think is different about how the world is dealing with this crisis?
There is a very striking difference in the global response, which is, where is the global response? What is the global response? There isn't a global response. The group of 7 leading industrialized democracies failed to agree a statement because of a ridiculous argument about the so-called Wuhan virus. The group of 20 that was founded during the global financial crisis 12 years ago, I was in government at the time, although not in an economic ministry. The group of 20 has been slumbering. The United Nations Security Council can't even agree a resolution on this. And the global aid system seems frozen in the headlights. And so this is a very striking global response, but by its absence rather than by its content.
It would seem that refugees are particularly vulnerable, particularly at risk in a crisis like this. How does that impact your work?
You're right, I think, to emphasize 2 things. First of all, we came into the COVID crisis with the record numbers of refugees and internally displaced. Figures 2 weeks ago showed 50 million internally displaced, 30 million refugees and asylum seekers. So the founding conditions were starkly dangerous. Secondly, the conditions in which refugees live, most of them are not in camps, interestingly enough. There's a misperception that most refugees are in camps, but actually only about 5 million refugees are in camps out of the 30 million. But in urban areas and elsewhere, they're often underground. So the danger is that if they get the disease, they live in conditions where it will spread fast, and they're not able to access the medical care that they need. Obviously, it's very much to the point that 85% of the world's refugees are living in poor countries, not in rich countries. You wouldn't believe that if you listen to some of the political rhetoric in Europe and the US. You'd think that most refugees were here. But actually, most refugees, as you, I think, I would guess know well, most refugees are in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh. They're in Lebanon and Jordan. They're in Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya. Those are the countries that are hosting refugees, and they've got challenges of their own. The only, if you like, balancing item is that half of all refugees and displaced people are under the age of 18. And so it does seem that the characteristics of the disease are less virulent, less potent, certainly less fatal for younger populations, and that may help a bit.
If you were speaking to leaders of the world, whether in the G20 or in countries with a lot of refugees, what would you say to them?
I'd say that we will all pay the price of neglect, and the neglect of the holes in the global safety net has been a real driver of inequality and insecurity over the last 10 years. And it threatens to become a material threat to peace, security, and development in the next decade if it's not addressed. I talked about the 2010s as being the decade of disorder, and we're getting a taste in the COVID crisis of what could come next. And I think it would be really important to appeal not just on traditional humanitarian grounds, but also on strategic geopolitical grounds, that the world needs to wake up to the dangers it's posing to itself.
What gives you hope?
As a team once said, if you look at the statistics, you get depressed. If you look at the people, you have hope. And so whenever I'm asked that question, I say, well, as long as people in need are showing courage, resilience, determination, entrepreneurialism, what right do we have to give up on them? So that's the source of hope.